Good morning. Welcome to this first Sunday of Lent. Hopefully you got all your announcements about the Bible study that we'll be doing on Sunday afternoons that we would love for you to join us with, and the walk to Jerusalem. If you ever have any questions about anything or you want to get a hold of me, I know that my information is now in the bulletin, so I look forward to hearing from any of you at any time. Today we are talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this well-known and oft-retold parable begins and ends with a question. Who is my neighbor? And the answer is, surprisingly, the stranger. The Samaritan, whose place of worship and customs are so different from the lawyer who questions Jesus, is both stranger and neighbor to the man who was beaten and left in a ditch. Both a stranger and a neighbor. That's interesting, isn't it? We tend to think of things in extremes, either or. Someone is a stranger or a friend or neighbor. Things are good or they're bad. They are good or they're evil. But if we're honest, that's not where most of us live. We live in the in-between places. We aren't all bad or good. We aren't always a friend or a stranger. We exist in the in-between. That's the theme behind this Lent season, the in-between. There's no denying that we're all keenly aware of labels, beliefs, and assumptions that make us strangers to one another. The lawyer asks, who is my neighbor? We essentially ask this same question in a million different ways. Who is in and who is out? Who should I align myself with and who should I distance myself from? Who can I trust and who should I fear? Jesus seems less interested in answering those questions, in answering who is his neighbor, and instead spotlights what the neighbor does. One of the downsides of this being a well-known story is we often lose the shock factor. Well, that, and we don't really have any strong feelings about Samaritans in our culture. But this was a big deal to those listening to Jesus. This was the last person the hearers of this parable would expect to stop and help. Just imagine for a moment if you were that beaten man. Through swollen eyes and a throbbing headache, you watched the Levite, then the priest, hurry right past you. Then to your utter surprise, a complete stranger, a Samaritan, stops and tends your wounds. The Reverend Jeff Chu wrote a commentary on this story, in which he talks about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking on this story. King had visited the Jericho Road in 1959. He saw its twists and felt its turns as it wound through the hills and sank into a valley outside Jerusalem. Along the way were so many potential hiding places for robbers to lie in wait, ready to ambush weary travelers. I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me, says King about the priest and the Levite. It's possible those men were afraid. Perhaps, he suggested, they were fearful and they asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? The Good Samaritan, King said, reverse the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Then he urged his listeners to imagine themselves on contemporary Jericho roads. Could they, would they, ask that same question if they saw someone struggling? This is a question that still resonates with us today. Could we? Would we? Could we look at a person struggling and see a neighbor or a friend in the face of the stranger? Or does fear keep us with our heads down, walking quickly by? I saw a story on social media this week about a woman who had a chance encounter with a stranger in a thrift store. The stranger was a young woman who looked to be too thin and had a cart full of beautiful china. The woman complimented the stranger on her find, to which the younger woman just kept her head down, nodded, and said a small thank you. Not thinking much more about it, the woman went on about her business. But while in the dish area, she found more pieces with the same pattern, so she picked them up and went in search of the stranger. When she found her, she offered them to her, and to her surprise, the woman began crying and then told her a story. She was fresh out of rehab, starting over after her husband divorced her because of her drug addiction. In his anger, he had gotten rid of her grandmother's china that meant so much to her. He felt guilty about it after he calmed down, but the damage was done. As she was shopping to furnish her new small apartment so she could have visitation with her children, she found this china set in the exact pattern of her grandmother's china. Here, on a cold Saturday morning in the middle of a thrift store, the woman had a choice. She could uncomfortably mumble sympathies and move on, or she could see this stranger as a friend and neighbor. Her choice was made as she put her arms around the younger woman and held her in the middle of the store as she cried. As she held her, she told her, "Maybe these dishes are God's way of showing you that everything will be okay. Maybe we met so you could be reminded of God's grace and love for you." The woman soon dried her eyes and thanked her. They said their goodbyes, and both left changed people. We all have a choice, but often that choice comes with vulnerability, and that can be as scary as any Jericho road with its twists and turns. Vulnerability appears in manifold ways in this one short passage in Luke. The Samaritan's risky mercy, the humanity of the priest and Levite, also the innkeeper's trust, taking a small down payment, believing the promise of more. There's the boldness of the legal expert too. He instigates this whole thing by asking a testing question, and it's essentially Jesus to meet even the self-righteous by staying in the conversation. We are invited through this parable to see ourselves in each of these characters. Some days I feel satisfied in my own goodness, that I'm doing enough. Other days I only have enough courage and energy to hurry past on the road with my head down, scared of what might lurk in the shadows. On better days, I'll meet people in good faith, believing their promises. On my best days, when the Spirit's with me, I'll encounter the world mercifully, staying tender-hearted enough to be moved with compassion toward not only those I know, but those I do not as well. I'm complicated, like every other human on this planet. Here's the good news. Jesus knows the complexity of humanity. In that knowledge, Jesus extends to us the same grace he offered the legal expert, remaining ever patient and always eager to remind us to love is what it takes to truly live. We are all fellow travelers. Some of us may be more neighborly than others, some days more so than others. But really, there are no strangers in our stories. As long as we make the choice to see one another, to see our humanity, our struggles, to walk alongside each other and bend down to pick one another up when life gets too hard. Make that choice. Be vulnerable. Live like Jesus. Amen.